Welcome back to Old Testament literature. This session, we're going to talk about what's called intertextuality, or how the biblical texts affect and relate to each other. And really, the idea here is that every biblical text is a part of the biblical canon, and in some way, shape, or form, they have some sort of consistency to them. This is also related to the idea of the divine mind or God Himself having inspired Scripture. There should be a common voice among them, and so there's going to be a sense in which the biblical text share from each other. And so we're trying to explore how that relates to the literature of the Old Testament when it comes to how we read it. How should we then deal with the fact that these biblical texts are citing, quoting, alluding to each other in a sort of back and forth conversational way? So let's get into it. So Longman begins his conversation by talking about Julia Kristeva. She coined the term intertextuality that is now used in biblical scholarship. However, most biblical scholars don't really follow her conclusions, including Longman, and he goes into that discussion. And so ultimately, just as this is Kristeva's view of how texts relate to each other. So she's going to say any text is constructed of a mosaic of quotations. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another text. So ultimately, she's going to say there's really no sort of text that exists on an island of its own. Every text had to be written in such a way that it communicates with, either directly or indirectly, other texts that are either coming in the future or came before it. And to be fair, you might want to think and say, okay, well, let's think back to the very first text. And I still think you can make this observation work. So if there is a sense where there was one written document that was the very first one in human history, which obviously we don't have access to today, even that very first document would have been a collection of thoughts and ideas that were a mosaic of quotations from other people. That first person who wrote would have had to have heard from other people, thought about these ideas, and had some sort of reason to communicate to other people that led them to write. And so, in a sense, every text is a mosaic, a quotation, or some sort of absorption of other ideas, other text. And then, obviously, once the first text is written, any other text written after that had to have some sort of influence to that one way or another. Now, as good as her observation is, she wasn't the first to make that observation. There's plenty in church history and all of that, but she's the first to make it popular in a modern sense. Um, Longman does make a very good point to say that once again, this is something that's more of an insight into the nature of text than it is a method. And so, even if you would agree with this observation, which I do and many biblical scholars do, you wouldn't necessarily want to follow Kristeva's method because she's much more of a deconstructionist when it comes to the method she's going to use because she doesn't really think any text has any meaning. So she takes this conclusion to say, since it's a mosaic of many other texts and quotations, you can pretty much read any text in light of any other text that you want. So you can take a text that's a love poetry and you can read it as if it's a curse or as if it's got nothing to do with love poetry or as if it's a narrative. Because at some point that love poem has some sort of relation to another text and you can just choose the other text that you want to read it by. That's kind of a unfair way to describe Kristeva's view, but ultimately that's what she's trying to get at, something like that from my perspective. And so Longman does a good job of just pointing out that that conclusion does not really follow. You can observe the same thing that she observed and not go to that same conclusion about how it is then we need to interpret text, even if text are mosaics of other text. So from here, Longman talks about three different types of intertextuality. So diachronic intertextuality is pretty much saying we need to find the earliest text and then the next text that was written after that, and then the next text. So pretty much we need to put all of the biblical text in order by which they were written, and then we can see which text is borrowing from another text because only later text can borrow from earlier text. So we can use one example here, like the book of Job, which is probably the most difficult one to use. If Job is the oldest book in the Old Testament, then we shouldn't be saying Moses, when he wrote the Pentateuch, is quoting the book of Job. We should be saying, that Moses, when he wrote the Pentateuch, if there's a citation between Job and Genesis, for example, that Genesis is referencing Job, not Job is referencing Genesis. But the problem is we don't really know when to date the book of Job. So it becomes hard. And so some interpreters who follow this view point have trouble saying, is Job the earliest? Is it the latest? Was it written sometime in the middle? Whatever. So they have trouble actually knowing which order of direction the citation goes, because that's important for this view. So another view is the synchronic view, which says it doesn't matter about the order. We can just decide which direction we want to read text in. So once again, using the book of Job as an example, it doesn't matter if Job was written the earliest. I want to read Job as if it was written after Proverbs. And so that Solomon, when he's writing Proverbs, Job is reliant on, the author of the book of Job is reliant on the book of Proverbs. And then they're just going to kind of read it that way. And that would be a sort of synchronic mode without trying to demonstrate the historical chronology related to when these texts were written. Once again, that also runs into problems because it breaks rules. Because if Job was written long before Proverbs, then Job can't be dependent on Proverbs. The book of Proverbs didn't exist. And so that also kind of has its issues. And then Longman talks about a third view, which is the view that I follow. Now, he doesn't describe my view of canonical intertextuality, but he does describe one view of canonical intertextuality. And ultimately, he's just going to say it's about reading text back and forth. The idea is that they're all a part of the canon. So therefore, we can kind of read them all together. My view is very similar, but a little different, and I'll explain that more here in a moment. But Tremper is going to go so far, once again, as I pointed out before, because he believes in the sensus plenior sort of view that you can take pretty much the New Testament and read it back into the Old Testament because it's all a part of the canon. So even though, in this example he uses, even if you would say the serpent in Genesis 3 was not Satan, the New Testament says it was Satan, so I'm going to say, even though it wasn't that case then, that would be Longman's view. It became that later, and Christians are fine saying, let's just go with what Revelation says, even if we can't prove that Satan was in the Old Testament at all. I just think that that's inconsistent, but that is something that Longman would follow in his sort of understanding of a canonical intertextual view. So before explicitly talking about my own view, I'm going to talk you through kind of where this started in my own research related to the book of Esther. But I also want to say really quickly as a reminder, Tremper Longman in the book does a good job of just kind of explaining, once again, those three approaches and all of that. And he gives plenty of examples of how you can apply those approaches to biblical text. So I'm going to give an example of how to do a canonical reading, or at least my version of canonical reading to the book of Esther. So this started with me noticing in biblical research that scholars were noting that there are all sorts of intertextual connections to the book of Esther. And I wanted to try to develop a method for how we can deal with that in light of the fact that Esther is a part of the biblical canon. So what scholars had noticed is that Esther seems to reference a lot of non-biblical text. And once again, if you get a copy of my book, Literary Allusions in Esther, you can, read through my chapter 2 where I kind of dive into all of this. But for now, I'll just list them. So one of them would be the story of Pseudo-Samaritus. Another would be the story of Ahikar. And then you've got the Chronicles of Cestius. And then you also lastly have this ancient origin text, Enuma Elish. So you can look at all of these and notice that there are some overlaps with the book of Esther. And scholars then try to use that to try to interpret Esther to say, like, okay, really Esther is just a retelling of Pseudo-Samaritus or a retelling of the Enuma Elish story. However it is that you'd want to deal with that. And pretty much I say that there's not enough data to prove that, but that's what some scholars would argue. But then from there, you've got a lot of scholars like Adele Berlin and so on and so forth who would say that the biblical texts also have been heavily drawn on by the author of the book of Esther. And there's a list here of the main ones. So like Jonah chapter 3 has a lot of connections to the book of Esther. Joel chapter 2, the Exodus narratives where Mordecai is very similar to Moses. And then you got the Samuel and King's narratives, which I deal with each separately in my book. And lastly, the Joseph stories, which is the strongest one of this list. So that's the one we'll explore more here in a second. But the overall idea here is that you've got a mosaic of biblical texts that it seems like Esther is also drawn from in different ways. And once again, you can read my book if you want to get more detail on that sort of analysis. So very quickly, I'll overview some of the connections between the MT version of Esther, which is the Hebrew version of Esther or the Masoretic version, and the Joseph narratives, also in Hebrew. And so what you'll notice here is that there are a lot of links between them, and I guess I'll just circle a few. So you've got, like in this first line here, that there's the third day of Ahasuerus' reign, and he gives a banquet with his official and servants. And then notice here in the Joseph narrative, you got the same wording. It's the third day. He makes a banquet for his servants and his officials. But then notice here, the officials I mentioned are the chief, Shar, and chief, Shar, baker, and cupbearer. Well, that's the same thing here, Sharav, which is just adding the possessive ending to the word shar in Hebrew. So the point being is there's no reason for him to have used that word. There's other words for official. So obviously, with all of these parallels, you can assume that there's some connection between the Joseph narratives. And the list kind of goes on. And so I won't read through all of these. Once again, this is a chart from my book, but you can notice these parallels here and kind of explore those more on your own. And just for the sake of being thorough, here's the second part of that chart. So just notice there's a lot of connections all throughout the book that seem to focus on the Joseph narratives. So it does seem very likely that the book of Esther was picking up on the Joseph narratives in the book of Genesis. And in all three methods, this sort of analysis would work. So diachronically, Joseph's story happens much earlier, and the book of Genesis was written much earlier than the book of Esther. In a synchronic method, it also makes sense. You wouldn't necessarily read Esther back into the Joseph narrative, so you can make that sort of argument that maybe the Joseph narrative was made up or something like that. It would maybe have to be your conclusion. But in general, the understanding that the Joseph narratives have something to do with the book of Esther kind of work in all three intertextual methods. So before I describe exactly what I think is a little bit problematic, even though those connections are there and they're very clear, the reason I don't think that that's a complete solution is because just having similarities between two texts is not enough to say that they're borrowing from each other. That's enough to say that there's some sort of intertextual connection, but that's not enough to say that there's some sort of authorial intention behind it. And to me, that's the key of intertextual reading, is trying to prove that a author is using a text and wants you to be acknowledgeable about that earlier text or that other text, is maybe another way to say it, such that that other text will help you interpret the text that you're reading. And so what I did in my research is demonstrate that the book of Esther can be broken down into 5 units that have 5 different themes that repeat in all 5 of the units. And the themes, are listed here. The king performs an act. So there's some sort of situational conflict. The king is advised. He implements the advice, and then a solution is provided. That happens in each section, except for the postscript, where you get the first part where the king performs an act, and the assumption being that, okay, the other parts would follow if it was necessary for that to happen. But obviously the story is ending, so you're not going to continue that whole pattern. And so the reason I want to point this out is because I think from here you can get to the heart of, okay, the main point of the book of Esther has to do with what the king is doing. That's the emphasis here. It's not God's sovereignty. It's not Esther and Mordecai's saving the people. It's not their shrewdness. Those are some elements of the book of Esther. That's not the most important element of the book of Esther, because that's not the most important things that are highlighted in the structure of the book. So in light of that, I demonstrate that the most important text in the book of Esther, are related to the texts that compare Ahasuerus to King Solomon, which I won't get into a lot now. I just want to point that out to you. In Jeremiah 29, 1 through 15, that letter written to the exiles, there's a citation of that in chapter 2, and then that's kind of referenced throughout the book in subtle ways, and then also clearly referenced in the last unit of the book. And I would argue there's this sort of overlapping and interlocking structure that connects the book of Esther together, such that you have the king's narratives being interlocked with the Jeremiah narratives, and the two things come together to help you interpret the book. So that the main point of the book of Esther is that we can be prosperous people, we can live as prosperous people for God's kingdom, despite who the ruler is, so long as we are the ones who do the commandments that God has given us to do, specifically the ones listed in Jeremiah, to let our children marry their children, to plant vineyards and be a part of the economy, and live and grow and seek the peace of the city. And that peace will also be our own peace, that as we get involved in cultural engagement, these two things will lock together, and that will lead to a more prosperous nation, similar to what Solomon had in his day. Even if you don't have that sort of divine wisdom in the king, we can supply that wisdom as we live as good citizens in any sort of environment. All right, so now we get into my view of how we do intertextuality, which I like to call cross-associative reading. Is I think you should put every intertext into levels of prominence. So I think there's always going to be kind of like a level 1, those are the most prominent, and a level 2, those that are semi-prominent, and then what I call trace text, or level 3, those which would have been influential because they follow the same type scene or the same literary elements, like it's a comedy, so it's going to follow the same elements, it's the same genre, things like that, so that there is some subtle influence, but it's not so important that you should reinterpret the book in light of that influence. And so once again, I'm not going to get into all of the details here, but what I demonstrate in my book is that these are the most prominent things, and that these things are actually being intentionally used by the author to help us interpret the book. These texts here are ones that are moderate, meaning that in some ways they're used to help us interpret the book, but not for the overall purpose or the overall themes, or they're not connected completely throughout the book in such ways that it affects everything. And once again, here with Jeremiah's letter, that's intended to stretch across this whole section here. Versus, these texts are kind of all just in the middle. So that, for example, here's one that talks about how Moses was exalted as a great man, and the same thing happens to Mordecai. So you're supposed to say, okay, Mordecai is in a sense following in the footsteps of Moses, God's prophet, but you're not supposed to say he's a new Moses necessarily, just that he's just as righteous as someone like Moses who's leading the people into a new endeavor in life. I think you're supposed to make that sort of connection. Versus here, with the First Kings ones, I think you're supposed to make a stronger connection that yes, we need to compare Ahasuerus to Solomon, and only one of these two is actually godly in everything that they do, or at least in everything that they're doing as kings for the most part. You're supposed to make that connection. But then notice here, we talked about the connection with the Joseph narratives, even though there are plenty. It's primarily because both the Joseph narratives and the book of Esther are what we call diaspora novels, or novels written to those who are living exile or living in a foreign land. And so Joseph has the same sort of plot structure as the book of Esther. And so therefore, that's why you're going to have so many of these similarities. They're written in the same genre, so they're going to use the same sort of vocabulary. They're going to follow the same sort of structure. They're going to have the same sort of events. They're going to have the same sort of banquet idea. They're going to have the same sort of assimilation of the main character, who the hero. They're both, in a sense, comedies, so therefore they're going to follow the same sort of structure. And so I would argue that we shouldn't just reinterpret the book based on things that are happening in the Joseph narrative, as much as we should know that it influences it and that there is some connection to be made there, but it's not as strong as some of the other ones. All right, so for our Riken activity, this time we're going to talk about tragedy. And Riken does a lot of time, spends a lot of time comparing tragedy to comedy. So whereas comedy has a U shape and is going to start prosperous, have some sort of turmoil that seems like it's leading to demise, and then have a happy ending at the end. With tragedy, it's just going to continuously go downward and lead to suffering. So Ryken's going to define a tragedy as a story focused on exceptional calamity, on the destructive power of evil, and the plot's going to relate to a choice that's made by the hero that leads to suffering. So the main elements, and especially in the traditional sense, are the hero's going to be a social elite, someone with a spirit of grandeur. They're going to have an essential character flaw. So like they're going to always rush in to want to save someone, or they never, think things through, which is similar to rushing in. Or they eat too much. So they always do that. Or they always give in to lustful desires despite every other good trait. Or they have too much money and they always want to give out their money. Whatever their character flaw is, that's going to lead them into a situation where they have to make a choice. And they're always going to choose, even if they have two options, they're always going to choose the option that leads to their demise. And then sometimes the hero is going to learn a lesson from that, but the tragedy and the suffering is still going to take place. And once again, Riken is going to contrast comedy to tragedy, especially when it comes to biblical literature, because he's going to argue that tragedy really doesn't exist in the Bible. Even if people get themselves into a tragic situation, they always end up with a happy ending. So he's going to say comedy is much more prevalent in biblical literature, even though tragedy is something that does tend to happen as well.